Imagine boarding a seemingly normal subway train surrounded by strangers, when suddenly something feels terribly wrong. The lights flicker, the sounds distort, and as the train moves forward, the sense that something is deeply unsettling intensifies. The air grows thick, reality begins to unravel, and an invisible presence seems to be watching your every move. What's real and what's an illusion? Would you be prepared to face what lurks in the shadows below? This isn't just another mystery video. It's a terrifying journey that will have you questioning every sound you hear and every movement around you. Before you continue, make sure to leave a like. As with every detail revealed, you'll become more engrossed in this chilling tale. What would you do if you were trapped on a train where time and space no longer make sense? Stay tuned for every moment, because the worst might be closer than you think. And remember, who's watching you on the subway? Get ready for a terrifying and immersive journey into the heart of a cursed orphanage, where evil doesn't just hide in the shadows, but seeps into the very walls. This is a place where lost souls still wander, waiting for innocent victims. What happened in that orphanage? What do the children who once lived there still whisper on stormy nights? The answers, however, are buried in the ruins, where every crack and every sigh seems to carry sinister secrets. Watch until the end. Pay close attention to every detail, because what you're about to discover will make you question what's real and what's just an illusion. Don't forget to leave a like if you're ready to face the unknown and follow this chilling story until the very last second. After all, would you be able to escape this place if it were you?
It was a cold and rainy night when, for the first time, something strange happened on the subway. The lights that illuminated the cars flickered intermittently, as if an unknown presence was playing with them. The sound of the flickering bulbs blended with the sound of the rain, creating a strange and unsettling melody. The stations, empty and silent, seemed darker than ever, as if the very underground of the city had become a place of pure fog and mystery. The air was denser, more humid, and even the sound of the tracks, normally constant, seemed more muffled, as if time itself was being distorted down there. With each stop, the train seemed to crawl with an unusual slowness, the doors opening with a deep, threatening creak, but there was no one to enter or exit. Those who traveled during these forgotten hours, lonely and restless, felt something in the air, something that couldn't be explained but became impossible to ignore. Feeling of being watched, that something was moving in the shadows, something that didn't belong to that place. The passengers, each lost in their own thoughts, barely noticed what was happening around them, but the furtive glances exchanged between them already revealed their discomfort. A man who was sitting alone, staring fixedly at the fogged-up window, saw a figure quickly pass by on the platform, a shadow that seemed to float in the air. He blinked, and when he looked again, there was nothing. The train continued on its way, but the feeling that something was there, lurking, followed all those who dared to continue their journey. The subway, which was normally just a means of transportation, that night seemed to be something different, a passage to the unknown, a place where time and space intertwined, leaving in the air the scent of unease and doubt. The legends began to spread. Stories whispered in the waiting lines, exchanged between suspicious glances and hurried footsteps. They spoke of a creature that hid in the shadows of the subway, an undefined presence, shapeless, but one that seemed to be watching them. Rumors surfaced, as if the very underground air was impregnated with something no one could identify, yet everyone could feel. No one knew for sure what it wanted, but everyone said that whoever looked it in the face would never be the same again. Those who dared to speak of it aloud were quickly silenced, as if mentioning it only drew its presence even closer. The first to report encounters with the creature spoke of a strange feeling, as if suddenly, the entire environment around them became heavier. The cars, already shrouded in an oppressive twilight, seemed to stretch into an endless corridor, where the shadows danced with a freedom never before seen. Those who were there, even without knowing it, felt the watchful gaze of something that never showed its face. And then the whispers began. It's somewhere, watching. It was said that those who dared to look at the subway's security cameras, which were apparently broken or poorly positioned, had seen impossible things. Distorted figures with disfigured faces moved among the passengers, crossing the aisles like ghosts. But when the same passengers tried to report what they had seen, the cameras, as if by miracle, seemed to record nothing. What happened in that space between stops was a mystery that defied reason. The most terrifying part, however, was the absolute silence surrounding the reports. Each story seemed to be swallowed by the same darkness that enveloped the subway. No one wanted to be the next to see what couldn't be explained. Those who shared their experiences were considered eccentric or paranoid, but something in their eyes, a gleam of fear, betrayed that what they said was rooted in truth. And so, the legend grew, taking hold of every mind, of every passenger who ventured along the tracks of that underground city. No one saw the subway the same way anymore. And with each cold, rainy night, the feeling that the creature was still watching them seemed to intensify, as if it were patiently waiting to appear where no one could see it, until the fatal moment. Each night, new reports emerged. Passengers who disappeared without a trace, vanishing as if they had never existed. The authorities, unable to find logical explanations for the disappearances, began to speak of theories about security system failures, but no one believed the official words anymore. The underground city of the subway was immersed in an ever-growing mystery, and people increasingly avoided speaking about what was really happening there. Some spoke of unusual sounds, like muffled screams echoing through the empty corridors. Others claimed that the screams were not just distant noises, but something deeper, as if pain was embedded in the walls of the subway. They came from places where no one would ever dare to go, at the ends of the route, where the train would slow down, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around it. These sounds, inexplicable and chilling, made the air feel even denser, colder, and passengers would squint their eyes, wishing they couldn't hear, wishing they couldn't notice. But no matter how hard they tried to ignore it, something was there. Then there were those who spoke of a pale woman with empty eyes, who would suddenly appear beside them, amidst the darkness of the train cars. Her skin was so white it seemed to reflect the weak light of the fluorescent tubes, and her lifeless eyes seemed to look through anyone. She would materialize without making a sound, her steps so light and almost ethereal, they seemed to defy gravity, as if she were floating. Many tried to follow her presence, but she moved with supernatural speed, always disappearing seconds later, as if she had never been there. There was no explanation for her sudden appearance, nor for the way she vanished, without leaving a trace, without making any sound. It was as if she were an illusion that came to life for a moment, only to disappear at the next turn. But the most disturbing of all the reports was from those who tried to call out to her. Some people, terrified, dared to extend their hand, shout her name, or ask who she was. No answer ever came. Her empty expression remained, and any attempt to interact was futile. She never looked directly at the one calling her, as if completely ignoring their presence. And, worst of all, when she disappeared, she left behind an overwhelming sense of emptiness, a disquiet that would take days to dissipate. With each night, the fear grew, and more passengers with wide eyes and trembling voices whispered about what they had seen. Everyone knew that by stepping onto the subway, they were surrendering themselves to the unknown, to the incomprehensible. And so, the legend grew. The pale woman with the empty eyes became a ghost that haunted each person who ventured into those depths, a mystery without a solution, a presence that was always there, lurking, waiting for the next curious gaze, the next fear, the next soul to disappear without explanation. On a particularly dark night, a man entered the subway after a long day of work. He was exhausted, his shoulders heavy, and his mind clouded by fatigue. He could barely keep his eyes open, and the last thing he wanted was to be interrupted by something supernatural. What he wanted, more than anything, was a little peace, a quiet ride home where he could finally rest. But, as if fate had another plan for him, that was exactly what happened. The train was emptier than usual. The silence in the air felt denser, as if even the sound of the wheels on the tracks was muffled by the darkness spreading into every corner of the car. It was just him and one other person, a pale, tired-looking woman sitting at the far end. She was so still, so motionless, that she almost seemed like part of the scenery. The man, with a sigh, tried to settle into one of the seats, attempting to ignore her and focus on his own exhaustion. However, at some point his eyes inevitably drifted to her. They stared at each other for a moment. The woman, with her head slightly tilted, looked at him intently in a way that deeply unsettled him. Her eyes were empty, lifeless, as though she was looking at him, but at the same time not really there. Something in the depth of those eyes seemed distant, as if she hadn't really been present for some time, as if her soul had left her body at some point before. The gaze wasn't threatening, but there was an intensity in the absence of expression that was disconcerting. The man tried to look away, but couldn't. There was something unsettling about the scene. The car, with its flickering lights and the distant sound of the train, felt more oppressive, as if time was slowing down. He felt a shiver down his spine, but couldn't quite pinpoint what was causing it. She remained there, watching him, not moving a muscle, not making a sound. At first, he thought it was just exhaustion, an illusion caused by lack of sleep, but the unease he felt was palpable. Each time his eyes met hers, a weight seemed to accumulate on his shoulders. He tried to focus on the walls of the car, on the tracks outside, but something kept pulling him back to her. Then something subtle, almost imperceptible, happened. The woman gave a slight movement with her head, a nearly invisible gesture, as if inviting him to come closer. He felt an inexplicable need to stand up, to walk toward her. But immediately, his self-preservation instinct kicked in. Something was wrong. He shouldn't go over there. But at the same time, the feeling that he couldn't move, that something was holding him in place, grew even stronger. With the train gently swaying, he felt the weight of his own doubt. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he shouldn't ignore the strange feeling forming inside him. He looked back at her, and for a moment her empty eyes seemed to deepen even further, as if they were an abyss. Something broke in that instant. It wasn't a physical movement, but a disturbance in the air, as if the very space around him had been distorted. And then, when the train passed the next station and the lights flickered more intensely, the woman disappeared. There was no sound, no movement. She simply vanished as if she had never existed. The man froze, his eyes quickly scanning the car. But what scared him the most was the feeling that he hadn't seen her body disappear. She was simply absent, as if she had evaporated. He looked around at the other passengers, but they were all absorbed in their own worlds, as if nothing had happened. The doors opened at the next station, and he stepped off, still dazed, with his heart racing. However, the sensation that something had followed him, something he couldn't identify, stayed with him. The woman's gaze, empty and piercing, didn't leave him. He knew that the underground city kept secrets that could never be explained, and in that moment, he felt as though he had just touched the edge of one of them. When the man tried to approach to ask if she was okay, the car shook violently. The sensation of an inexplicable impact made him lose his balance, and he was thrown to the side, crashing into the nearby seat. Before he could get up, the woman disappeared. There was no movement, no sound. She simply was no longer there, as if she had never existed. Her absence was so sudden that for a moment, the man was paralyzed, unsure if all of it had been just a hallucination caused by exhaustion. The train stopped abruptly, with a loud crash that seemed to slice through the air, and the lights went out. The silence that followed was profound, absolute, a silence that felt hollow, as if the subway itself had plunged into an endless void. The man tried to compose himself, his heart pounding in his chest, and the cold air that filled the car seemed to freeze his lungs. He looked around, but there was no one else, just him and the darkness. The rest of the train was deserted, immersed in that supernatural stillness. For long minutes, no one moved. Everything was motionless, as if time had stopped. He felt the weight of growing solitude, the pressure of the silence tightening around him. Fear settled within him, a mix of confusion and dread as he tried to process what had just happened. Then, in the midst of that emptiness, he heard something, a distant sound of footsteps, dragging slowly through the car. He froze, his senses alert, trying to identify the source of the sound. But there was no one there. The sound drew closer, but still, the man's eyes could not find anyone. Those footsteps continued, but the feeling that they weren't coming from a physical place unsettled him. It seemed to resonate from within the very structure of the train, from some hidden, distant place. Then, his gaze was drawn to the far end of the car, where a shadow moved quickly. It wasn't a person, nor something with a defined shape, but rather an indistinct presence, a dark mass crawling, almost imperceptible. It was large, but its form was fluid, constantly shifting, as if made of pure shadows, lacking any contours. The man breathed heavily, adrenaline coursing through his body. He tried to scream, to call for someone, but his voice seemed to fail, choked by his own throat. His feet, as if weighed down by stones, couldn't move, and he remained there, frozen, watching as the shadow drew nearer. The train was immersed in complete emptiness, except for that presence which moved slowly, silently, as if feeding on the darkness itself. The man felt a chill spread through his entire body. He knew with terrifying certainty that this shadow was not natural, that it didn't belong to the world he lived in. It was there, in that space, just for him. And as it drew closer, a growing sense of hopelessness overwhelmed him. He knew there was no escape anymore, that all of it was beyond his control. Then the shadow stopped, and the silence returned, even deeper, even more suffocating. The man felt a pressure on his head, as if the air around him was being drawn away, as if his very existence was being slowly drained. He closed his eyes, waiting for the worst, but nothing happened. When he opened them again, the car was empty. The shadow, the woman, the footsteps, everything had disappeared. The train resumed its motion, as if nothing had happened, and the lights flickered back on. But the man knew that something had changed inside him. The sensation of emptiness, the inexplicable pressure, the fear, all of it remained now etched in his mind. And the question he couldn't answer was, what else was there, waiting to be seen? The woman was never seen again, but something about her remained, like a shadow that doesn't dissipate, lingering in the air even when the eyes can no longer see. Some people said that she was the very spirit of the subway, a condemned soul who traveled incessantly through the underground city, without a destination, seeking revenge for something that no one knew exactly what it was. Those who spoke of her, in low and nervous voices, said that her presence was a curse, a force that inhabited the train lines, doomed to remain there, waiting for unprepared souls to get lost in her web. Others, however, believed that she wasn't an ordinary spirit, but a shadow of a forgotten past, an entity so old and dark that no one dared to understand it. Some spoke of ancient times, of stories buried beneath the stations and tracks, stories of tragedies and disappearances without explanation. And amid those legends, the woman seemed to be the symbol of something that had been long ago, a presence that crossed eras, tied to the very essence of that place, made of pain and silence. The subway, in turn, seemed to guard secrets that would never be unraveled, as if it were a prison stretching deep beneath the earth. Its walls were impregnated with old stories, echoes of voices that had never been heard, memories lost in the cracks of concrete and steel. The dark tunnels, with their flickering lights and muffled sounds, became the reflection of a city that chose to forget what really happened down there. But those who ventured to travel the tracks later, when the shadows took over, could hear whispers, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere distant, as if the walls of the subway were talking to each other, sharing the secrets they had witnessed over the years. The feeling that the subway was more than just a means of transportation, that there was something deeper and more sinister behind the daily routine, slowly spread, but in an irreversible way. Those who traveled at night, alone or in small groups, no longer felt the same safety as before. Each stop, each curve of the tracks, seemed like a promise of something invisible, waiting in the shadows, in the spaces in between. And so the subway continued its journey, carrying passengers but also holding the mysteries of a time that should not be remembered. The woman, with her empty eyes, her pale figure, seemed to be nothing more than a symbol of what happened in the depths of the city. But what she truly represented, and what had really been lost in the underground, would never be fully revealed. Whoever dared to ask too much, who risked unearthing the buried secrets there, would be consumed by the darkness of that place, becoming part of a story that would never have an end. Other passengers who entered after that began to report even more bizarre occurrences, as if the subway itself had become a distorted reflection of something that should not exist. Some stations, once routine and known to all, began to shift locations, moving in an inexplicable way. The architecture of the platform seemed to twist, the walls stretching and distorting, creating passages that no one recognized. It was as if the space itself was being remodeled, defying the laws of logic and physics, turning into an endless maze. Certain trains, once predictable and punctual, no longer stopped at the correct stations. Instead, they traveled to unknown destinations, crossing lines that had never been mapped, entering tunnels that weren't on the itinerary. The passengers, initially uncomfortable, soon realized they were being taken to places they couldn't understand. The train continued its journey, but no one knew where it was going anymore. And when the doors closed, something even more disturbing happened. An intense cold took over the carriage, something that had no explanation. It wasn't the usual cold of old subways, but a glacial sensation, as if the air was being sucked out, leaving the environment lifeless. The icy wind seemed to penetrate the bones, leaving the passengers stiff. Then, a sensation of constriction, as if an invisible force was squeezing them, flooded the hearts of everyone present. It wasn't just the physical fear of the cold, it was something deeper, a feeling that something was about to happen, but no one knew exactly what. The vision began to distort, the lights of the carriage flickered, and reality seemed to dissolve into a murky fog. The faces of the passengers became blurred, as if their very perception was being altered. Time also seemed to slow down, as if the seconds were stretching infinitely, creating an unsettling void in every breath, in every heartbeat. The train kept moving forward, but the world around it was becoming more and more distant, more unrecognizable, and the passengers, now petrified, found themselves unable to react. Fear paralyzed them, as if their bodies no longer responded to the commands of their minds. Some tried to get up, others called for help, but the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. Every movement was slow, every word seemed unreal, as if time itself had stretched to prevent any reaction. The doors of the train opened at some stations, but no one dared to leave. It was as if something outside was even more terrifying than what awaited them inside that carriage. And so, the subway continued its journey, increasingly disconnected from the reality they knew, transporting the passengers not to the destination they had planned, but to a place beyond human comprehension, a place where the laws of space and time no longer applied, and where fear and mystery waited, invisible, lurking. However, the greatest mystery was yet to come. On the last trip of the night, a group of people entered an apparently normal carriage, with nothing to suggest what was about to happen. The sound of the doors closing was muffled by the low murmur of conversations, and the train departed with its usual silent routine. However, as the train continued its journey, something began to change in a subtle yet disturbing way. First, the lights started to flicker frantically. It wasn't just a simple electrical failure, but something much stranger, as if the very electricity of the subway was being affected by an invisible force. With each flicker of the lights, the faces of the passengers began to distort, not physically, but in a way that made the reality around them disintegrate, as if the very space itself was being twisted. The outlines of the people seemed to stretch and deform, as if the very reflections on their faces were struggling to stay intact. One man, eyes wide open, tried to look at his reflection in the window but saw only a blur, something he couldn't recognize. The air inside the carriage began to grow dense, as if the oxygen was being slowly drained. The heat began to accumulate, the temperature rising unbearably, as if hellish warmth was seeping into the carriage, suffocating the passengers. The bodies began to sweat, the air becoming sticky and heavy, as if the very atmosphere was being compressed. The sensation was that the train, the subway, was becoming a prison, a space that no longer wanted to let the passengers escape. Each breath became harder than the last, and everyone was aware that something terrible was happening. Conversations quickly fell silent, passengers exchanging desperate glances. They began to move restlessly, trying to open the doors, trying to find an exit, but everything seemed futile. The doors wouldn't open, and no matter how much they pressed the emergency buttons, nothing happened. The passengers' eyes widened and panic began to grow uncontrollably. It was then that, amidst the flickering lights and stifling heat, something even stranger happened. A shadow, which seemed to slip through the cracks of reality, appeared at the end of the carriage. It wasn't a person, nor a creature, but a presence that made the passengers' hair stand on end. The movement of the shadow didn't follow the laws of physics. It seemed to be made of pure darkness, floating between the seats, distorting the environment around it. There was no sound, nothing except the strange movement, and the oppressive feeling that it was coming to consume them. The passengers tried to scream, but their throats felt closed. The air was so heavy that breathing became a constant effort. Reality seemed to be breaking apart around them, as if they were being pulled into another dimension, a dimension where logic and order no longer had a place. The shadow moved closer, more and more, and with each step, the heat increased. The sound of hearts pounding in chests became deafening. When the shadow finally reached the center of the carriage, everything went dark. The lights, the heat, the distortions, everything vanished in an instant, leaving behind only emptiness. The train continued its route as if nothing had happened, and the passengers, still in shock, were now alone, in an empty carriage, unsure if what they had experienced was real, or if they were trapped in a reality that no longer made sense. But one thing was certain: the greatest mystery of the subway still remained, and none of the passengers could ever forget the feeling that something was watching them, something that was no longer confined to the train, but was now following them, invisible and eternal. The train didn't stop. The doors didn't open. The usual sound of the stops, the faint noise of the doors sliding open, simply didn't happen. The carriage continued on its path, immersed in an oppressive stillness. Time seemed to have stopped there, inside that train, which no longer seemed like part of the city. The air inside the carriage was dense, as if something was about to happen, but none of the passengers dared to move, as if by making any gesture, they would disturb the delicate balance of what was happening. When the train finally reached the last station, an absolute silence took over the atmosphere. The doors opened, but there was no one there. No sign of who had been there before. No trace of life. No sound, not even the echo of footsteps that used to traverse the empty platforms. The carriage was immaculate, without marks from anyone, as if it had never been inhabited. There were no papers scattered, no forgotten tickets, not even a simple wrapper fallen on the floor. The train was empty, in such an absolute way that it seemed like a lost dream, a vision that vanished with the first light of day. All that remained was the echo of something indescribable. Perhaps a scream, perhaps a lament, a muffled and distant sound that still resonated in the empty walls of the tunnel. There was no clear origin, but the sensation that someone or something was there, lurking, didn't fade. It was as if that scream, that lament, was ingrained in the very space in the cracks of the metal and concrete, echoing forever in an infinite loop, a silent warning, something that hadn't been completely erased by time or darkness. The subway continued to operate, heading toward its next destination as if nothing had happened. The rails creaked under the weight of the train, but the atmosphere was different. Something dark, inexplicable, lingered in the air. Something that shouldn't have been there but now was a part of those tracks, those stops, every curve and tunnel. A subtle presence but palpable, like a shadow stretching and curling into every corner of the subway. And as the train continued its journey, there was now an unsettling feeling that it was no longer just taking passengers to their destinations. It was waiting patiently for a new victim, someone who dared to step into its silent doors. And for those who ventured to board, something awaited them in the shadows, something that couldn't be seen but was felt in every second, like an invisible weight, a pressure that built up, making the air denser, more oppressive. The faces of the people, when they finally sat there, might begin to distort, just like those who had been there before. The train would continue its journey, but now it was more than just a simple transportation line. It was a place of mystery and fear, where the past and the present intertwined, and where the unknown waited patiently, in silence, ready to pull anyone into its darkness. The sense of unease lingered, like a constant presence that wouldn't dissipate, hovering over the subway and its passengers. As the days went by, the legends began to spread slowly among the night workers and solitary passengers. Stories whispered on the stairs, on the platform benches, exchanged in furtive glances and hurried steps. Each account seemed stranger than the last, mysterious figures appearing in the dark, sounds echoing through the empty tunnels, an indescribable feeling that something or someone was always watching, waiting in the darkness. The subway continued to be a place of transit, a routine that never stopped, but now something had changed. The air in the station seemed denser, as if the space itself was impregnated with unsaid secrets. When the doors closed, and the train began to glide along the tracks, passengers would glance around with an increasing distrust. Something in the walls, in the gaps in the doors, in the distorted reflections of the windows, seemed to suggest that the subway was no longer just a means of transportation, but a place that hid something deeper, something that couldn't be explained. And although the subway continued to operate as always, no one ever looked at it the same way again. That routine of hurried travels, of arrivals and departures, was now interrupted by a persistent feeling that the subway held something unseen, something misunderstood, that hid in the deepest shadows of the tracks. Each curve of the tunnels, each empty carriage seemed to hide a forgotten story, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. In the carriages, the silence felt heavier than ever, and those who traveled alone, especially at night, sensed a presence that couldn't be identified, but was there, inside the train, with them. With each stop, with each distant sound coming from the depths of the subway, the feeling that something was lurking intensified. Fear wasn't something visible, but it was in the subtext of every glance, in the small hesitations, in the way people rushed to leave, as if fearing what might happen if they stayed there for another second. The sensation of being followed, that the tracks could take them to an unknown destination, disturbed everyone. No one dared to stay alone at a deserted station or travel the more remote lines during the early hours of the morning. The subway, which once seemed like a simple urban necessity, was now a place surrounded by mystery, an intersection between the real and the unknown. And yet, despite everything, the subway continued to operate, taking people from one point to another, day after day. But in the dark and vast underground labyrinth, no one knew for sure what was waiting for them. No one knew what hid in the deep shadows of the tracks, in the abandoned passages, or in the broken security cameras. One thing was certain: the subway was no longer just a means of transportation. It was a space where shadows and secrets intertwined, where the unknown dwelled in the depths, patiently waiting for anyone who dared to cross its path.